thank you for coming. We want to say anything other than, you want to start?
Well, I'll just say, thanks everyone for coming, and we want to emphasize that the proceeds from this is all going to the Historical Society. So, donate generously. All right. So, why don't you tell where the title came from?
Well, we threw a bunch of, I don't know, I'll say what I, and then if you want to add to
Yeah,
this.
go ahead.
We threw a bunch of names out, or just ideas for titles, and if you know me, you know I'm kind of picky. And so I, sort of thought about each one, and I wasn't sure what I was aiming for. I knew what my thoughts were about the book itself, which actually changed over the years, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But if you've looked at the book, what's the thing called? The afterword sort of talks about where this title came from, or illustrates this title, I guess I would say. Things were lost, things were found, things were remembered, and not necessarily all at the same time. And so, obviously some of our memories have been lost, and then you see something that brings it back, and I don't know what else I'm supposed to say about this. But you've got thoughts.
Well, probably Rob's going to talk about the genesis of this project, but I'll just say when I came into this, I would say 2 years ago, but he's been working or thinking about this for much longer than that. And I think he just needed a little impetus to kind of bring it to completion. But when he was describing what he had in mind for this, it was like, again, we'll have a picture in a minute that will epitomize that it was a Chester that is forgotten. So, there's lots of generations in this room today, and so some people will remember Chester as we did, and some people will remember it from days even before that, and some people will have been recent, arrivals to town, and will think it's always looked the way it looks now. And so the purpose of this was to show the amount of change that's happened and how things, although small New England towns oftentimes, don't change a lot, but I think the amount of change has been surprising. That's what I got from Rob as we talked about this project. And so I proposed to him the name Lost and Found, right? Because it was things that were forgotten. We're trying to bring them back through the photographs and the stories. And he added the remembered part because that's what he does. He remembers these stories that we've accumulated, mostly him, through having, talked with prior family members, generations, and residents, and so forth. So that's kind of where it came from. And why don't you switch this now? Pushing the wrong one. Well, it was on before that.
Yeah.
There we go.
Oh.
So I guess where this really came from is here. Go ahead.
Okay. This is a picture of our mother and grandmother. And
Which is which, by the way? My grandmother loved this picture because it's obvious why, right?
But just to give a little bit of background about why I did this book, why we did this book, just to give a little of our history. We're a fifth generation Chester family. And basically our family were factory workers. They were not, nobody affluent. They just worked our great-grandmother worked in the shoddy mills out on the west end of town, factories that made material, cloth, cotton, satinette, cotton wool, linsey woolsey stuff. Our great-grandfather worked at Jennings, the ubiquitous auger bit factory in Chester. Our grandmother worked at Bishop and Watrous from the time she was 14. Our mother was the first to graduate college in our family, and she became a pharmacist. To correct the newspaper article, our grandmother was not a pharmacist. She was a factory worker, but she also was a bookkeeper. So she did the bookkeeping for Bishop and Watrous. And then when my mother and grandmother opened our pharmacy in 1950, my mother had been working during the summers in the pharmacy in town for Ernie Collins, and she agreed, they agreed that she would take it over when she got out of college. So our mother and grandmother bought the business. Our grandmother became the bookkeeper, our mother the pharmacist and manager. Both of them graduated from Chester High School. I think our grandmother was the first one in our family to graduate from Chester High School. Her siblings did. They just didn't finish high school, because again, they were just factory workers. And the book came into being, we all worked my brother, sister, and I all worked in the pharmacy in some capacity. My brother not as much out in the open as my sister and I, so most people didn't know he existed.
Not true.
He'll agree to that. He knows that's true. So when you serve a population that goes to a pharmacy, it's a lot of older people that have a lot of medication. And I was, for many years, I was the primary delivery person. I was the only delivery person. And so I would go, if anybody remembers Geneva Scoville, 96-year-old woman, I would go to deliver to her, and I'd sit and talk to her for an hour and a half. And because my mother owned a business, I didn't get, in trouble for that. I'd go to the post office, and I remember running into people in the post office. I'd take 45 minutes to walk to the post office, which was just, across the street. But I would gather stories. I'd hear stories from people all over, all through the town, all different ages. We had a strong influence from our great aunt, our grandmother, who, again, lived in town and grew up in town. So they all had family stories. I would love listening to, I'd love it when my mother would get talking about her childhood. So a lot of the stories in the book, even though they may seem like they're generic stories or ones that I picked up off the street, these were primary sources that I got these stories from. So it wasn't, 90% of them were not hearsay from somebody else, carried on. They were people telling me stories that I got right from the people that happened to them. There are stories about the hurricane and someone running home after school who happened to have detention, running home from school in the middle of the hurricane with trees falling on, around her. That was my mother. And that was her story. So, primary source.
Well, I want to emphasize this aspect of the project, and the information in here is 99% in my brother's brain. So I take no credit whatsoever for the content, but I did, I think, have some influence in bringing, as I said, to get this done. And I think one of the most important reasons that I pushed to get this project done, that Rob's been thinking about for probably, 10 years maybe?
I won't admit how long it was.
Well, is the point that he just made is most of the information in here is not something you can look up somewhere, right? It's not in the town land records, it's not in newspaper archives. It's first-hand accounts of daily life, and it was, again, from the people who lived it. And that's not something that, can be found when the people are gone. And thank God that my brother absorbed this information and has become a repository for it. And I thought it was really important. And every time I come to visit him, I don't live in town anymore, by the way, but every time I come to visit him, I get the quiz about whether, who lived in what house and what was their family and how far back. And so, it's amazing what he knows, and it was really important for me to prod him to get this in writing so that it would be available for later generations. That was my main accomplishment, and that's what I'm most proud of.
When I started thinking about this book, I was thinking about the Arcadia Press books that many towns have, and it was going to be simply a picture book, a bunch of pictures and some captions. We can go to that.
Yeah.
But as time went on and I went through pictures, Diane will attest to the fact that how many years, well, don't tell how many years, but this box has been in the basement down here in our archives room saying Rob's box with, pictures that I had pulled out. And, I just wanted pictures that had not been seen printed somewhere so that we could, get them out so people could see them. But then things ended up being, stories that, so stories then drove the book as opposed to the pictures driving the book, which is, I think, a big shift and an important shift. And this photograph is actually, as the cover photograph, this was the epitome of what I wanted to tell, what I wanted to come across in this book, is that view was a commonplace view in the late 1800s. Yet, you live in that neighborhood today and you don't even know where it is. So, and I just, first of all, it's an amazing photograph. I love that photograph. I just think it's absolutely incredible. Just the composition of it is just, but it's like a whole different time. And as we were commenting, or Tommy was commenting that if you live here now, Chester's a quiet town. If you lived here 100 years ago, Chester was not a quiet town. It was noisy, and noisy meaning machine noises, manufacturing noises, trip hammers and lathes and all kinds of things. It was noisy. And that's another thing that's hopefully going to be illustrated in this book. I'm assuming you all know where this is now.
No, we're waiting for you to tell us.
Okay. Well, I'm going to use, I have to refer to it as names of people that don't live there anymore, but the house that Stuart Jocelyn grew up in, the Cadwell house, this was in front of it. So this, if you were standing at that front door looking out, you'd be staring at Straits Road. This is West Main Street looking toward the center of town. The house that you can see in white is, I believe, the Wasilewski's house. I think they still live there. Doreen Jocelyn's is just beyond that. And Bruce and Bev's house is just before that. So the house that went with this building is still there. I don't know who it is, and I don't know the number.
Do you know about what year that picture was?
It was taken in the late 1800s. That building was torn down in 1932, I think. Francis?
The name on the shop, on the store, do you know the name of it?
It's Julia Smith's.
What's that? Okay.
And then after that, Julia Smith sold it to Wilson. It became Wilson's store, and then it was torn down. But again, this building, and the other interesting thing is this building, another thing about Old Chester, old, I gotta get to this. Old Chester's things, people didn't tear things down when they were done with them, usually. Eventually it did, but it had a previous life. This building was built on High Street, sort of across from the firehouse, and it was a recreation hall for the factories like Jennings and Griswold Shop, which is our mill building now. And so it was a recreation hall. They held church services there. They held social things there. And then when the churches were built, new churches were built, and other places like this were built that could house events like that, that building was sold and moved to this location. So before it was torn down, it had many lives. Another thing that we wanted to illustrate in this book. I want to.
I was just flipping through the scrapbook, the Kate Sullivan scrapbook the other day, and I believe, I may be wrong, there's a picture of that building in transit on the road, being hauled by a team of oxen.
Carrie had it on his Facebook.
And we didn't include that picture because that's already out there. This picture was one we had not seen anywhere, so that was, in choosing what photographs to use, a big criteria that Rob had was things that had not been in previous publications.
There are a couple things that have been used before, but just to illustrate a point. But so, Tommy really had a really big part in making this book. Well, if someone asked me the question, and actually Rita Christopher did, why would someone not from Chester want this book? How would it be interesting to someone else? So I probably should let you answer that question, but
I'm not sure where you're going.
oh, okay. Well, so many of the things that are are, illustrated in Chester and with the photographs in this book are indicative of any small town in New England that had transitions, that survived the years, survived the changes over the years. One of the big things is transportation, and how transportation and improved transportation changed the town and changed what happened here and what didn't happen here and what, why it doesn't happen here anymore. And so, because Tommy's an economist, brings in a lot of the financial and the, business aspects of, economic aspects of why things changed the way they did. Me who's like clueless to business stuff. For those that don't know, I'm a kindergarten teacher. It was sort of enlightening to me, and it's like, oh yeah, it does make sense. Because when I started being interested in history, it was local history that I was interested in. And then, again, gathering the stories from my grandmother, spending time in her attic and dragging things out and saying, Gran, what's this a picture of? What's this a picture of? Where did this come from? And we go on vacations and we go to places like Sturbridge Village and Gettysburg and, other historical things. And somewhere along the line, I started, not that I'm there yet, started putting those into the larger picture. For example, this is not in the book. Civil War, our family has Civil War letters that our great-grandmother's brother and sister, I may get that wrong, but letters back and forth from the Battle of Chancellorsville that were in my grandmother's house. They were just in a drawer in her house. Both sides of the correspondence that were saved. And so, that got me interested in the Civil War and thinking, oh, this is really cool, how it related to Chester. But then, you got to look at the bigger picture. And because of that cache of letters, I decided I needed to take a college level history course, which I never took until I got my certification to be a teacher. So I'm like, I'm going to take a Civil War course. And, it opened up my eyes to the bigger picture. And again, Tom brought a lot of that into this book to connect Chester to the.
All right, so let's proceed. So I want to just elaborate just a little bit on what Rob just said, because I think this is, again, one of the things that is somewhat maybe surprising, especially to younger folks, even younger than us, about small towns in New England. And one of the things that I learned in my education as an economist, I wouldn't characterize it as business, it's more, what are the things that drive industry, what are the things that drive the way businesses operate, and there are some really simple factors that matter. One is transportation costs and the ease of transporting not just people, but goods and services and raw materials and shipping goods to market and so on. And the other thing is economies of scale. And so in the early days of the Industrial Revolution in this country, which, mid to late 1800s, small towns were factory towns. They had multiple factories. Many of you know that the buildings still exist in many cases. The mill building, Jennings is not there anymore, but Brooks is down the road, and several of them. They were producing manufactured goods, and Chester is known for the auger bits that Jennings created. I don't know if any of you ever watched the show on PBS, The Woodwright Shop, sort of a traditional woodworker with hand tools. And he makes this show in North Carolina, but he often refers to Jennings bits in his show. And I think it's astonishing that a town this small, and there's nothing unique about Chester in this respect. Every town was like this that had streams running through it, right? Because it was water-powered mills that were operating. So any town that had a stream or a river that was flowing downhill and had sufficient power had factories, numerous factories. But eventually, as costs of transportation got lower and lower, railroads and better roads and so on, these factories naturally moved and took advantage of scale economies, and they moved to the bigger cities. And so early mid-20th century, Chester stopped being a factory town. And the buildings were abandoned in many cases. And the town started, transforming into the town that we grew up in, which really wasn't a factory town anymore, or had stopped being one. And now it's, it's basically a gentrified suburb nowadays, right? It's more like an art colony rather than a factory town. But that's a very different situation than if you were here 100 years ago. It would, as Rob said, it would have been a noisy, probably dirty, smelly place. And it's not kind of the way we think of our quaint little town. But we wanted to, remind people about this important aspect of Chester's history. So that's just my 2 cents as a kind of a, from my own training as an economist. But I think it lends a lot of insights into, how things change, right? How things change, even as many things stay the same. There's lots of changes, even in a few generations, how much it's changed.
As you can see, that we've divided the book into 5 sort of general categories. I'm not going to read them. But I want to, the disclaimer that I'm going to give is where we knew the dates, they're mentioned. If the dates were not known, a general time frame was given. So things may seem vague in places. That's because we didn't know the specific dates. I already told you that most of the stories in the book were told directly to me. They weren't, third generation stories. And even though a lot of them are told generically, they were personal stories to a lot of our family members. So, the other part of this is one view of Chester. There are many other views of Chester. Everybody here has stories that could go on and on and on.
I mean, there is a bias here. We admit it. It's a bias from Rob's, primarily, the people he talked to, our family. So there's lots of, in some cases we are open about it being our family involved. In other cases it's just, our family, we don't say so. But we think it's representative. So even if folks who are not from Chester, they'll see something that maybe will remind something that their grandparents told them. They had a similar experience, sledding on the roads. I mean, we can't imagine nowadays sending our kids or our grandkids out on the highway, on the streets, to go sledding. But that was a common thing. And that's one of the stories we tell about is sledding on these various roads, going from Goose Hill all the way down to the center of town. That was common in those days, and you didn't think twice about sending your kids out to do it and not seeing them all day. Even when we were kids, we'd be roaming the streets in the center of town. Our parents were running the store and we had to be somewhere. So we were running around the center of town. No one thought a thing about it. If that happened nowadays, there might be some consequences.
We'd go foraging at lunchtime. All right, so we're going to go through and there are just a handful of pictures from the book here that we're going to show because we want you to buy the book. So this is not a, And some of these, are going to be pictures that but, pictures that you may not have seen. This is a really good illustration of the Chester that has changed, Chester that hasn't changed. Some things have, and some things certainly haven't. Carrie was just mentioning, we were looking at some films from the 1930s, 1950s yesterday, and the center of town is virtually unchanged in the last 90 years. Here you can see the only difference between the two. The one on the, if you know your cars, my mother always knew her cars, and she goes, "Oh, that's a 19 whatever," and I'm like, anyway, the only difference you can see in this building, in these two, which were taken, decades apart, is Feinstein's building, or the Flatiron building, which was built in 1913. So obviously the one on the right is before 1913, and the one on the left is after 1913. And the only other difference is, other than the cars and vehicles, is the little building that Tommy's pointing to, that was a meat market.
It's there too.
It's in both pictures, and it's changed over the years, and now it's gone. And that must have been torn down. Somebody can answer that better than I, but in the 50s, I think early 50s, because it's It's not there in 1958 when It Happened to Jane was filmed, but I don't know exactly when it was filmed, torn down. But I mean, it's just fascinating to see what's changed and what hasn't.
Next.
Anything. I don't want to put people on the spot, but raise your hand if you know where this is. I know that our historians know where it is. This building is on the corner of School Lane and Main Street at the top of the hill, across from Chesterfield's. It was built, as you see it, in 1865 or something, as a two-room schoolhouse. It still stands. It's the only building that was a bed and breakfast in Chester, but it had many lives in between. And so if you went to school, I was told if you went to school, the town originally had, well, individual one-room schoolhouses. This was the last one that was built as a standalone, and this was a two-room schoolhouse. And I know that my family lived on Bochum Road, and prior to 1905, when the Chester High School, Chester Consolidated School was built, the individual schoolhouses were used, and my family went to the Middle District School, which was on the corner of Bochum Road and West Main Street. But I was told that if you wanted to go beyond a certain grade level, because I think that went only up to maybe 6th, if you wanted to go to 7th or 8th grade, you had to go to this school because it was bigger, and then if you wanted to go to high school, you had to go to Deep River. But anyway, back to this building. So after this building was built, or after the high school was built, the Union School was built on High Street in 1905, this building was sold privately to private people, and it became a saloon and inn owned by a man named O'Connor. And then in 1919, correct me if there are any Cunios here, or Stalls, the Stalls bought it, and it became a bakery. So in the basement there were installed bake ovens, and they were... They are still there? Oh, so one of the pictures in the book is my great-grandfather tending bar in the basement of this building when it was O'Connor's bar. And I just think that's kind of cool. But anyway, and then after that it became a private home, and then it became a bed and breakfast, and now it's a private home again. Yeah. Oh, it was O'Connor that raised the roof and added a second floor. Now, in the little town of Chester, as I've said to anybody that's listened to me, Chester made an amazing variety of things manufactured, in those early factory years. But it also, in the 20th century, had a very large commercial laundry. And probably many of you have relatives that work there. I know my grandmother and my mother did during college. It was on Maple Street. It's where the Bishop and Watrous, I don't know if they call them Bishop and Watrous condominiums now or not, but the condominiums on Maple Street. But it was a commercial laundry, and it served in East Haddam and Moodus. There were a lot of summer camps that people from New York would come up to spend the summers. Cave Hill, Clark Crest, whatever Frank Davis was before that, Banner Lodge. This company, the Chester Sanitary Laundry, did all of the laundry for them. So it was a major, big factory, big concern. And it had one of its little branches in that small town of New Haven, which is kind of cool. The main one was here, but a branch in New Haven.
So notice that all of the workers in this photograph are women, and there were several factories, my brother can be more specific, in town where the main workers were women. And this is not during the wartime, for example, when there were no men to do the jobs. this was truly a town in which women worked in factories. My brother mentioned these letters we have from the Civil War, so this is 1860 something. And the sister writing described how she had to go out to work at the shop out toward, out west, probably one of those textile mills or whatever. And probably most of the workers in that mill were women. The mill building that's now the historical, the brush shop,
Yeah, fresh out.
which is the restaurant, right, whatever it's called now.
By the waterfall.
By the waterfall, it's a restaurant, but it was chart house for a long time. That was the brush shop, and they were mostly women as well, and there was a group of women called the Brush Shop Girls, and there were several pictures of them.
One is in the book.
One is in the book. One of those Brush Shop Girls was our Aunt Agnes, our great Aunt Agnes. Probably did Auntie work there too?
I'm not sure.
Well, in any case.
Wait, one of the others was Lydia Fargo, who was a well-known early Chester photographer. She was one of the brush shop girls.
So there were lots of women in the workforce in those days, which I think is probably contrary to what one might think about work in that era, but it was still, I would say, do you agree, it was segregated, so the men would be working in the Jennings factory and probably some of the other that had more, machine-intensive kind of work, probably was mainly men, if not exclusively men, and the women were working in maybe the textile mills and the laundry. So there was a segregation there, but I think it's interesting that there were a very large percentage of workforce were the women.
One could say we were lucky enough to have colorful relatives. This was our cousin's father. I'll hesitate to mention his name. One of the last real peddlers that had obviously a peddler's wagon who sold absolutely anything and everything. For those that know, this was Fred Walden. Not the nicest man in the world, but our cousin's father. Our cousin was Helen Rafuse, whose name I'm sure many people recognize as a colorful soul herself.
Yeah,
Anyway.
Miceli's are related, yes, that's true.
Our father was the newcomer, so we're related through our mother's side.
The Yankee side. So anyway, this I think is an amazing photograph of his last days with a wagon. He then built an antique store on Middlesex Avenue opposite. Thank you, Gilbert Hill. I was going to say Pelton Hill. Opposite Gilbert Hill, and ran that as an antique store for many years. And cousin Helen worked there, and her mother worked there. He was also. There's another whole bunch of stuff in the book about Fred being an avid hunter, and he would go coon hunting, and he would take coon hunting parties up. Did you put a picture? Was there a picture on somewhere that you used?
Not recently. I used it in something else.
Oh, okay. I know I saw it somewhere. But anyway, so there's some stories about his coon hunting and the meals that his wife would prepare afterward for their morning breakfast.
I'll just add one more bit of economic history to this picture, and that is that, in the days of the peddlers, the sellers came to the buyers, right? So the transportation costs were apparently such that it was cheaper to take the products to the customers. That changed, obviously, when we had creation of central business districts and brick and mortar stores, and so then people would go to the businesses, kind of the reversal of that, right? And the shopping mall is kind of the limiting case of that. But what are we doing nowadays? We're kind of going back to the peddler days in some sense, because now Amazon, all of those things, right? The products now get shipped to us. So again, it's kind of a return into a modern day kind of peddler system in terms of the economy. So it's just the interplay of transportation costs and how business operates, right, is driven by that largely. So I think an interesting kind of point.
Anybody recognize this photograph or this location?
It says Middlesex Avenue.
does, but do you know where on Middlesex Avenue? It's a long road. It's right in front of St. Joseph's Church. Yep, and if you look very carefully on the far right, you want to use that? You can see the fence for what was the Pratt House. But this is the laying of the trolley track, obviously, and
The church would have been right around.
would be, not would have been, it's still there, it's there, yeah. So the interesting thing about this photograph, other than the obvious about the train track and stuff, is look at the vista. There are no trees. You can see all the way to Deep River Town Line. That it's clear. And then what I find very interesting is looking at the height of the roadbed compared to the trolley track, and the differences there. But there's a whole section about transportation in the book. And again, we talked about how transportation changed things. So the trolley ran, as most people have read in our other books, if you've read our other books, the trolley ran in Chester from 1914 to 1917. We were the northernmost point.
Well, I think where the tracks, I'm always astonished when, visiting again, and we'll take little walks, and I say, show me where the trolley went. So it's obvious where it's here, it's coming up on Middlesex Avenue, but it took a sharp left turn and went into North Quarter Park, and then it went down behind School Lane, and that's all wooded land now, and you can't even imagine. It was probably totally clear of trees. The trolley went down there, and then it, I guess, took I don't know if it was a gradual turn back by the entrance of Fountain Hill Cemetery and emerged there, or Laurel Hill, and then went to the center over by the stone wall with the Chester on it. And there's and that was the end of the line. So imagining that route, it doesn't seem possible today, the way the land is.
To continue that same thought, this is basically where the trolley would have come out, sort of where the trolley would have come out in the center of town. The building that you see there is Rick Price's house, and in the field in front of it, on this side, is where the post office stands. And it was a hayfield for the Wilcox farm. And so there are stories in the book about different families, and obviously here there are people, the Wilcox family, for example, that had an amazing outreach out of, away from Chester. Most people know about Katie Wilcox. If you go to the United Church, you know about Katie Wilcox, who was one of the Wilcox sisters, who became a missionary in India, sponsored initially by the United Church, or the Congregational Church. And there's a college that she helped found in Madurai, India, and the chapel is named after her. It's the Katie Wilcox Chapel, and it still exists today. So it's kind of neat that, people from Chester touch, across the world. And her brother, who he grew up in that house that you see there, as Katie did, and then he bought the house at the top of the hill that became Chesterfields, and enlarged it, and put all the brickwork in, and he was instrumental. He was the council for the building of the America United. I don't understand the details, but do you?
No. He was involved in the construction of the Panama Canal. And he was
And that's where he made his money.
legal counsel for probably the construction company that did the work. I mean, that's astonishing.
And so that's why where he got all his money to make the improvements at Chesterfield's. Where Chesterfield's is, he had a tennis court, he had, again, the brick lining everything, and it was a beautiful home. It was a private home back then.
Also notice the hillside there, and Rob's not sure what house that is, if it even still exists, but this, can you imagine that view today? You can't imagine a view like that today, right?
That's where the Pratt house would be on now, Solowitz's former home, Carol's house. Now, you you all probably recognize this building, and most of you probably know that it was a theater, our only local theater in town. But, you know, there are a lot of interesting stories about this building. For example, I'm going to talk about Irene Aronson, who was an organist at the Catholic Church and music director for 53 years. She was one of the last people to play the piano for the silent movies that were filmed here. And the stories that she had to tell were hysterical, because she would say, you know, some of the people that played the piano were not always paying attention. So when the movie was delivered to be shown, it came with cue cards for the pianist to play. And so you had to play the scenes according to what kind of a emotion you wanted. And so if you were not paying attention, you might make a love scene turn into a chase scene or something. So those things that you don't think about these days. But the other thing that was important about this building for Chester history is when the high school was built in 1924, Chester High School, added on to the Chester Consolidated School, or the Grammar School, whatever it was called, many names. It didn't have a gym. And so Chester High School did have basketball teams and other teams, well, basketball teams, they needed a court. So the upstairs of this building became the high school basketball court. So if you can picture the building, it's a long, narrow building. So the out of bounds were the walls, the side walls. Spectators could be on either end. And so, again, my mother would tell stories about how the basketball team, if the play was going on, they were playing, and one team was getting a little ahead, and they were on a run, and they wanted to slow things down a little bit, throw the basketball up, hit one of the light bulbs that was hanging there, smash! So they would have to stop the play to get a ladder to take the light bulb down, sweep up the broken glass, therefore changing the...
Sounds like a Geno tactic, doesn't it?
So these buildings that it was built as a feed and grain store, but it had a lot of other uses. Buildings were not just used for one thing. And changes. Oh, before it changes, anybody that remembers, like from our childhood age, Johnny Ding's garage, I think about the next thing that went into that space was, I think it was called the Country Cottage. And it was a cute little gift shop. And if that woman that owned it, she was so nice, if she ever saw, I'm sure she didn't, what it looked like, it was Johnny Ding's garage. It was one of those garages. It was the far bay door, and it had a pit. It didn't have a lift because there was nowhere to lift it to. So to work on a car, it had a pit. And I, as a child, I remember I was in the garage many times, but it's like the back wall you never saw because it was like black. You didn't know what was in the back there. And then, again, thinking about that pit when she black down there too. And then it became this cutesy little gift shop. So, to me, this says it all. There are so many things that are not photographs that tell stories. My great-uncle, Maynard Gray, you can see his name there, he owned what was called Christensen's Garage. It was on the corner of, it was at the head of Main Street. It's now Chester Finders, whatever that's called. And so, I had a lot of stuff from his garage that sort of was hanging around. And just interesting that, so there are some things about rationing from during wartime that, tell some interesting stories. Chester Fair, the thing on the left, the Chester Fair, it used to be held here originally. And it's been in a couple other locations. But the Chester Fair used to be not just a 3-day carnival thing. When it was here, They had, the same competitions of, vegetables and produce and all of that kind of stuff. But they also sponsored a play with adults and children, the whole community, on Fair Night. The Grange, I think it was the Grange, sponsored a big dinner, had a big dinner the night of the fair. There were special, individualized little things. I mean, a lot of the same things are the same now, but it had individual things. Betty can attest to the decorated baby carriage contest. I think she's the proud winner. Did you bring the ribbon with you? But just things that were a little different, things that stayed the same.
I'll just call your attention to one of the cast members on this one here, Angelina Hobbs, Shirley Bennett, that's our mother, who you saw a picture of earlier. Notice the description of the character, the brat next door. From what we heard about our mother, that was a well-cast role. I think that's our last one.
So before I read talk about the thank yous, there were also, I wanted to comment about one thing, another photographer in town that was not mentioned and I discovered too late to put it in the book, Art Zanelli, who lived on the corner of Ferry Road and Middlesex Avenue, kitty corner from Moravellas. He was also another well-known photographer of the, mid-1900s. And he took the aerial photograph that's facing the title page or the next one. I wanted to credit that to him, which I didn't realize it was his photograph until afterward. But there were other stories that may be of interest to people. As I said, there were a lot of school stories, stories about It Happened to Jane, stories about Let's Give Jessica to Death, the movies that were made in Chester, stories about the hurricane, ice harvesting, sledding we talked about. I don't know what else. So,
Lots of stuff.
yeah, good story. So anyway, thank yous. Number one, thank you to Carrie, just for being Carrie, and all the stuff she did and tolerated with me. Carrie's incredible and wonderful to work with, and she knows I feel that way. Thank you to Diane Lindsay for all of her help in digging up pictures for me and scanning a lot and just consultation and just being there. So I appreciate that. In the first incarnation of this book, Jody Dole did a whole bunch of scanning for us. So thank you to Jody Dole. I'm going to jump to Ginny Anderson. Thank you, Ginny, for, again, tolerating me and my pickiness. Ginny works for Tiger Press and was our liaison with the printer. So thank you.
And that was he's understating it to say he was picky. but it's thanks to that pickiness that I think the product is as nice looking as it is. And the press, of course.
And so I have to add to that. So and Ginny, I didn't say this to you when I saw you, but when I saw the final copy, I called my brother, I called Carrie, and then I called Tommy, and I'm like, all right, I will go to the signing now.
We were all very worried.
Other people, Sherry Ferrari, Christian Arcaro, Chester High School Alumni Association, the Cunios. Those are people that lent photographs. Larry McAllister from Paramount for allowing us to print some pictures from Let's Give Jessica.
By the way, we could not locate. There were plenty of pictures of the Jack Lemmon Doris Day movie, and our uncle had taken a lot of them. But there were plenty of those around. We were looking for pictures of the
Personal pictures.
1971, 1970-71. We remember watching the filming of that. And so if anyone has any of those that are personal ones, the Historical Society would love to get copies. We had to get permission from Paramount to use, we had to send away to get pictures to use because they're just, you know, they're copyrighted. And so if anyone has personal ones, that would be a really good resource for the Historical Society. Yeah.
And so I have to say, I want to thank anyone and everyone who saves pictures and tells stories. Because if it wasn't for those people, this wouldn't have been able to happen. There'd be a bunch of pictures with, you know, people save pictures and I don't know who it is, you know, so thank you so much for people that have shared their stories and tell stories. So keep telling stories, keep, you know, keep it going. This is just, again, one snapshot.
If you have people who have remembrances of town, older relatives, or interview them, write down, get them to tell you what they know. Write it down. Get a record of it. As I said earlier, a lot of these stories, there's no record of them anywhere. It's in people's brains, and it's got to be put down. So everyone can be a historian. We're amateur historians just because we love history, we love our town, but everyone should be that way. And just get a record, because you never know when the next, you know, inquisitive grandchild is going to come along and say, you know, tell me about this or that. I mean, that's how Rob started, you know, digging around in his grandmother's house or his aunt's house and finding something and running to her and saying, tell me about this. And that's really where this came from. And so you don't know what ultimately will be the product of that.